Good day, everyone. My name is David Williams, Executive Director of the International Association for Energy Economics. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar entitled Impact of COVID on the Power Sectors in Emerging Economies and Actions for Recovery. We are grateful to Dr. Prad Bhagwat and our distinguished panelists for today's timely discussion. We're also grateful to the Indian Association for Energy Economics for co-hosting this webinar with IAEE. First, a little bit about the International Association for Energy Economics. We are the largest association specializing in the field of energy economics and provide a forum for the exchange of ideas, experience, and issues among professionals interested in the field. The organization produces 2 professional journals, a newsletter, and holds conferences and virtual presentations, along with a host of other products and services that you can find on our website at www.iaee.org. If you're not already a member of the association, we welcome you to join. A few housekeeping matters in regard to today's webinar before I hand things over to our moderator. First, this webinar is being recorded for those that cannot participate in today's live event. If you have questions for our panelists, please click the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window and type your question. We've allocated sufficient time at the end of the webinar to address your questions. And now I would like to introduce you to our presider, Dr. Prad Bhagwat, Head of Research, FSR Global and Research Fellow at the Florence School of Regulation, who will lead this webinar. Prad, over to you.
Thank you, Dave, and very welcome everybody to this webinar on a topic which is very, very relevant. We are all going through a time which is unprecedented. The COVID-19 situation has taken different shapes across the world, and I think the emerging economies are still trying to deal with this issue. As can be seen by the different GDP and other macroeconomic numbers that are coming in, there has been a huge impact on the economy and on industry across the world. The most low-hanging fruits that you can see is the service industry, the tourism industry, as well as a lot of transport industry that has been impacted very severely by the COVID-19 virus. But no other industry, I think, is safe. And the power sector itself, being a fundamental industry that supports and energizes the rest of the economy, it has had a big impact on the power sector as well. We have seen this impact in terms of strange changes and dips in demand when we had the lockdowns in different countries, and as the lockdowns got removed, there was a slow uptake and uptake. But I think this is something that I will leave my esteemed panelists to talk about. Today we have a very interesting set of panel from 3 countries out of the BRICS. We have Alex Field. He is from the Brazilian regulator. He has more than 15 years experience working for ANEEL, the Brazilian energy regulator, as well as he is a fellow at the Florence School of Regulation. From South Africa, we have Rula Inglesi Lotz. She's an associate professor at the University of Pretoria and also the chair of the South African Association of Energy Economists. She will give us a view and a perspective on Africa. And then we have, of course, Dr. Sushanta Chatterjee. He is the Director of Regulation and Policy at the Central Electricity Regulatory Commission in India, to give us a perspective on South Asia and Asia in general and how we are dealing with the coronavirus situation from the power sector perspective in this time. So, so the idea of this webinar is that I will ask a broad question, and each of the panelists will have about 4 minutes to give their opening remarks. This would be followed by about 1 to 2 minutes for a response from each panelist. And while having this response, I would also request our attendees to put in any questions that they have in the Q&A box. I will pick up some questions now, and I will leave some for the end of the discussion. So we can go quickly into the first part of this discussion. And I think I would like to start by bringing in Rula. And Rula, what do you think is the impact on your countries and generally on Africa's power sector due to COVID-19? Please, the floor is yours. But I would also like to say that I'll be a bit strict on time so that we can get as many questions on it. So 4 minutes, please.
Great, great. Thank you very much. Thank you for including me in this discussion. Indeed, the impact of COVID, not only in the energy sector, but broader in the economy and the societies, is vastly different between the different between countries in different developmental stages, and that we can see. And just a remark that I would like to make, that all my answers are based on the experience of South Africa and a little bit extended on the African continent. But my belief is COVID just managed to intensify pre-existing problems. I had a discussion with my research team this morning that did some work on whether COVID is a black swan event, so once in a lifetime, for example, or something that we don't expect it to happen and we don't know how to deal with it because we haven't been prepared for that. And in that sense, that's exactly what it did to South Africa, for example, and specifically the energy sector. So to give a little bit more perspective, South Africa is out of the peak at the moment. The economy has opened. We were quite a big hit. We had quite a big hit during our winter months, June, July. But we're talking about 650,000 cases on a population of 57 million. So you can understand the share there and the impact there. So to get into the electricity and energy sector specifically, what we saw is, like the rest of the world, a shift between, especially during strict lockdown, between manufacturing and commercial to residential sectors. And to give some perspective, the residential sector in South Africa, electricity-wise, is serviced by municipalities. So the municipalities in the country buy electricity from the national utility and they sell to the users, to the residential users, while the manufacturing sector, for example, buys straight from the utility. That created an imbalance in the whole system. We're talking about the distribution systems had to adapt to that. People are working now from home, so the commercial sector has changed, has gone back to residential sector and more than the industrial sector. The other thing that happened to South Africa is, in a very unbalanced system already, with waves of load shedding hitting us every year, we had the situation where the conditions worsened. So this year's power cuts, load shedding in effect, are compared to the 2009 case, which was the worst case in South Africa. And why that happened, there are many reasons behind that. There's not only one reason for this. It can be because of maintenance that could not happen in months that the utility and the distributors thought that they could do it, because some of the sectors, industrial sectors, were closed, replacements could not be made. We trade, we import some of the parts to maintain some of our fleet and distribution network, so that might have been a problem. Also, we had one of the colder winters in the recent years, so that also intensified the electricity demand and energy demand in effect. And also, finally, our big new power plants, the coal-generated power plants, Kusile and Medupi, that would add to the supply side, are in such a big delay, years of delay to be fully operational. So that affected us as well. Policy-wise, the moment COVID hit us, the agenda, the priorities in the agenda of the policymakers changed. The health sector became a priority. The procurement of renewables slowed down, or it got affected, particularly wind during strict lockdown. These things are catching up now, but surely in the first 6 months of lockdowns had a severe effect. Finally, electricity access, energy access is a problem in South Africa, a little bit less, but the rest of the African country, the African continent, definitely. The situation intensified, the problem became more prominent, more obvious, because now people had to be back at home and they didn't have access to electricity and clean energy, or even safe energy, secure energy. Also, many people lost their jobs, which means they had less disposable income, which meant they could not afford to pay their bills, in simple words. And if they could not afford to pay their electricity bills, that affected the utility. It's a bad circle that started. It was there, but now it became much worse. We're having a utility that we talk about a debt tenfold the last few years than what it was, while the tariffs of electricity increased fivefold. So we see that the situation financially is becoming worse and worse. And in current times, and with that I will close, I'm posing the question, through the stimuli packages, how many countries can afford, and South Africa, African continent, and the rest of the world, how many times can we afford bailouts of companies and utilities and sectors that underperform compared to rethinking and looking at the new solutions that we should invest on? Thank you very much.
I think you ended up with a very interesting question, and that I think I can actually jump to Sushanta very easily, because India is also having issues with utility, but today is not the topic, the topic of the discussion. However, how is India doing, Sushanta? And how would you answer Rula's question shortly in connection with COVID?
First, Pradyumna, thanks very much, and the entire team of International Association for Energy Economics, and also the Florence School of Regulation for inviting me to this webinar. It's always a wonderful experience to interact with experts, especially from other countries. You always cross-learn, and the question posed is one such link in terms of understanding and sharing mutual experiences between countries. I totally agree. I mean, bailout is not a long-term solution, but as people say that this COVID-19 is an extraordinary. It's an extraordinary event, and it needs extraordinary interventions in terms of finding out solutions. How do countries move out of this? So there is no straight answer to this particular question as to what to do. I mean, all countries, especially the developing countries, have been striving to strike at the very root of the problem. I mean, in any case, even before COVID-19, for instance, India, we had been struggling with various issues on the economy per se, and that has a direct impact on the electricity sector, on the power sector per se. So, for instance, there was a big dip in the overall, demand side of the economy, which in turn has been impacting the power sector in the country, because the biggest problem that we face here is in terms of the kind of tariff structure that we have of different consumer categories. You have the domestic, agriculture, industrial, and commercial consumers. So we have a high element of cross subsidies between consumer categories. So if suppose there is a dip in the overall economy in terms of demand from the C&I consumers, that means commercial and industrial consumers, because they are high paying, they are subsidizing consumers. So the revenue loss of the distribution companies, the suppliers, is so high that it affects the entire value chain, because it is the consumers who pay the load serving entities or the distribution companies, who in turn sustain the transmission companies and the generating companies. So if the fundamentals go wrong, there is a big problem. Then this is exactly the problem that we are facing here in India, because especially even before COVID-19, especially before March 24 is when we declared lockdown here in India. Even prior to that, we were trying to wriggle out, we were trying to fathom as to what to do in terms of reviving the demand, which in turn can sustain the entire value chain in the power sector. That COVID-19 and especially the lockdown further dipped. In fact, just to give you a figure about, I mean, our peak demand has been in the range of about 175 gigawatt to 118. It dipped down to 110 megawatt, and the biggest impact was in terms of the reduction of demand from the C&I, which is the commercial and industrial consumers, which dented the finances of the distribution companies and of course the entire value chain of transmission and generating companies. No, so I mean, when it comes to discussing the steps that we have taken, possibly some of these questions, I mean, I can throw some more light on what we have been trying to do. I mean, see, there are.
Shanta, we will get this into the second question.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
So, thank you, Sushanta, for cutting you short there. But
No,
I'll come back to you in the next round. But Alex, we already see patterns. We already see that South Africa or India, the issues that existed actually became worse. Interestingly, what I like what Rula said, that load shedding increased, although demand decreased, load shedding increased, which is a very interesting point as well. That way, Brazil has its own unique system, hydro dominated and very different. But like India, you are still struggling with COVID. We are second number. You're on number 2. Number 3 now. What do you see as been the impact in Brazil of COVID, and what is the situation right now?
Okay, so good day, everyone. Thank you very much. Thanks to the International Association for Energy Economics, and thanks to you, Pradyuma, for the invitation to participate in this webinar. In fact, we see a lot of similarities. We see that, in fact, COVID intensified a lot of problems, and that intensified the need for finding solutions fast. So there are two sides of this coin. The COVID team is still very complex to address, but it is the team for 2020. We don't have a doubt. And it is interesting to be able to contribute. I have been following the steps that my country has been taking in the policy level and in the regulatory level where I come from. And although this participation is closely related to my work as a visiting fellow at FSR, I must state that the views and information are mine, and they do not reflect those of ANEEL, okay? Brazil is that big country in South America with a large population, 211 million people, which is roughly half of the European Union and 2/3 of the population of the United States, with good GDP, but lots of inequality. So it's a poor developing country. And as expected, COVID hit Brazil very hard. In the electricity sector, we have a different way of organizing, I can say. It is pretty much centralized in the federal level. We have one regulator, one system operator for the transmission, one electricity trading chamber, one Ministry of Mines and Energy, and dozens or hundreds of companies operating in generation, transmission, distribution, and trading. But policy and regulation is pretty much centralized in the federal level, which helped a lot on the measures that we're taking, and that we are going to talk a little bit later. Generation it's one of the cleaner mixes in the world, with hydro, with storage as the main player, and that makes the system run on the long term, and that has a lot to do on how things are organized in my country. The COVID pandemic arrived a little bit later in Brazil, in late February. The state of emergency was declared by the Senate on March 20th, close to India, almost the same date. But the direct impact was very severe. We had more than 130,000 deaths so far and more than 4 million cases. Just recently, I think this week, we lost the second position to India, and I'm sorry to hear that. And all of that was, the problem of COVID was heated with internal debate, it was blended with politics. That made it a little bit worse, things worse. Common measures were lockdowns, closure of non-essential activities, remote working and learning, things like that, pretty much the same that we saw in other places. The main players in the electricity sector established contingency plans and special task forces related to the issue. We had some important direct impacts. We had some numbers that were centralized by the Ministry of Mines and Energy. And the last report that I have from 2 days ago is that in the Ministry of Mines and Energy, besides the minister that had COVID early in the year, we still have 8 people sick, 333 recovered and 1 death. And at the regulator where I work with 672 workers, 12 are still sick, 35 recovered, and I lost 2 colleagues. But we had important indirect impacts due to the measures for the containment of the pandemic and or as a consequence from the impact in the economy. And I can talk about the exchange rate that rose 30% regarding the dollar and the euro. And that increases the cost of international finance, increases the cost of electricity that comes from Itaipu, which is a binational power plant that supplies roughly 10% of the electricity in the country, and increases the cost of imported equipment like solar panels, converters, etc. And in the electricity sector itself, we see the pandemic as an extreme event on the demand side, such as other countries. We had a large reduction in demand in the most important months, up to 15%, going to almost 20% of the demand, concentrated between March and July. And that impacted the revenue of the distribution companies. But sectors were not equally affected. We had even an increase in residential consumption with more people at home. And vehicles, beverages, and textile sectors, that suffered a little bit more, going up to 75% in reduction in demand in some months. The demand already surpassed 2019 levels in these last weeks. So we are going back to normal, back to what we saw last year, electricity-wise. But we still have to see what lies ahead. The impacts were very important. They will continue to be felt or dealt with in the long term. But things seem to be going back on track in Brazil. And I'll give you back the floor.
Thank you, Alex. Sushanta, I think I will come back to you for your reaction first this time. A very interesting point that Alex made was there was an impact there on foreign exchange, which led to the increase in price of electricity from Itaipu. India is dependent on other countries for its natural gas and many times coal. Did you also see any sort of impact on imports, also because of the constriction in imports in terms of transporting goods from one place to another? Was this a problem for India in any way, or not so much?
It's the other way around. Like we have in India about 25 gigawatt of gas-based generation. And so it's not huge compared to about 380 gigawatt of total installed capacity that we have. It's a very minuscule percentage. And their plant load factor, that means their capacity utilization, is in any case very low. But interestingly, it's been the other way around. The gas prices have come down so sharply that they have become more viable. I mean, it's the other way around. So that's one. And also because, the plant load factor of the coal-based generation has also gone down substantially, which in turn has obviated the need for import of coal. So I would say that, I mean, import for that matter has been, it's been favorable in terms of impact on the, although for a very short period. That's in very brief answering your specific question.
And Rula, did you have some insights on how South Africa dealt with the supply mix during this time? Because I suppose that you spoke about having maintenance issues, which meant that probably some plants which were critical were down. So maybe you can tell us more about it.
Sure. So South African's fleet electricity power plants are aging. It's a problem we've been discussing for many years, and it's we're talking about plants that might be complete decommissioning by 2030. So we're talking about old plants, but at the same time we have the new plants, as I said, the Kusile and Medupi, that hopefully will be fully operational in the next couple of years. What happened, I think there were short-term and long-term effects of COVID. As I said in my previous comment, procurement of renewables almost stalled in the beginning with a strict lockdown where everything was closed. But now we're talking, I was looking at the announcements this week already. The national utility is procuring big amounts, big units of new generation that will be operational by December 2021. And we are discussing that the utility will start utilizing renewable sources for the electricity generation. So the mix starts coming in place. The integrated resource plan, the strategy of the Department of Minerals and Energy in South Africa, if you Google that, you will see there are many IRPs through the year. So we have the 2010 and the 2012. It's not that we are updating our strategy so often, it's just that it remains a draft and then it needs revision and revision, which also creates some uncertainty with regards to supply mix, because the previous draft did not have nuclear in the mix, while the latest draft has nuclear in the mix. So it creates a little bit of an uncertainty when it comes to investors. With renewable energies, I think we've realized during lockdown and during this overall crisis that we need a system that is more flexible, that is more adaptable, and we know that renewables have some resilience. I'm of the opinion that we should have a good diversified mix so that we cover for any fluctuations in the market of any of the different fuels. So I think we are going forward looking at a more diversified mix in South Africa. That's my personal view. And especially with the natural resources that South Africa has, especially solar and wind. We are not as lucky or as blessed, let's call it like that, with hydro as the Central African continent, for example. Zambia bases most of their supply mix on hydro, but we have abundance in wind and solar that I don't think we have used its full potential yet.
Thank you, Rola. Alex, quickly to you before we move on to the next question. But did you, so you have a different issue because you have a lot of hydro and you have non-hydro renewables as well as a bit of thermal. So did you see any big impacts on your generation mix? Maybe thermal not functioning at all, or
yes, we did have some impacts in the operation, some good, some bad. We did use less gas and less oil for generation because of the reduction of demand. So the overall generation mix was cleaner, so less emissions, which is good. Also, since we had less demand, we could store more water in the reservoirs, so the system is better prepared for the next months. We have some storage that we didn't think about having some months ago, but we will have for sure a postponement of new generation that were supposed to come in the next few years. So we canceled some auctions for new power plants. And I don't know, I don't think there is a decision yet on the last auction that was supposed to happen this year. I think we will only have an option for transmission lines, but we don't know yet. But I guess from figures that I got from the system operator that we are going to postpone around 5 gigawatts of new generation for the next years, since this year we're supposed to end up with minus 3% of demand and a little bit of rebound, going for positive 4.3 next year, and then coming back to the average that we have of about 3.8, 3.6% of growth each year. But we will lose a little bit of new generation because of this, for sure.
Okay, indeed, indeed, there's going to be a bit of loss of momentum in terms of the economy, and then there's going to be a growth. We have to see if this, I mean, it looks like a black swan event that it will take some time to come out of. It was first 2 weeks, then 2 months, and now it's 6 months already. But I think countries have already started taking steps, short-term, medium-term, long-term. From the European Union's perspective, you see the Green Deal and the Sustainable Recovery Plan, which is still focusing on the word sustainability. I think this was something Sushanta had already started speaking about, but so Sushanta, now we can get into more details about what sort of actions for recovery has the government of India, the regulators taken. We can break this into two, and then maybe when I come back to you later, we can talk more about how there can be cross-learning between different regions and different countries. Over to you, Sushanta.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how much, I mean, of course we'll have time constraint, but I think I would like to briefly comment on some of the thoughts that emerged in the previous discussions, especially on the, a need for a diversified portfolio, as Rula mentioned. And also I think there is one question in the Q&A which is critically important, and I think we must get inputs from or responses from all the panelists. Do we expect emerging policies will cause a long-term shift away from the clean energy because of the high cost and the reliability? And in fact, this was exactly what I think Rula also mentioned. But I mean, of course, my personal view is that you do need a diversified portfolio for managing the power system. There is no denying the fact, but I would like to highlight one interesting fact that we observed in the context of Indian power sector. And in fact, during these, lockdown periods, for some states in India, we found that there has been growing use and utilization of the renewable energy sources, especially wind and solar. Why? Because it's an energy only contract, so at least the recent prices are quite competitive if you leave aside the balancing cost. And when the load factor of the thermal generation goes down, the per unit cost goes up. So you have to pay the fixed cost irrespective in the kind of contracting structure that we have here in India. The per unit cost, fixed cost of thermal generating fleet goes up, and even we experienced in case of some of the states, they were optimizing by shutting down or lowering generation from their high cost thermal plants and replacing them by wind and solar to the extent possible. Of course, it's not as firm as that, but then that's a very interesting event that we observed. It's not a uniform pattern across all states. But the important thing that I would like to highlight is that that need for balancing was to some extent addressed by the regulator. We at CERC, Central Regulator, we created and introduced a very interesting market instrument called the real-time market during this COVID period itself. 1st of June 2020, we introduced a real-time market, which is basically half-hourly market. That means during the day, 48 times during the day, you can go and buy or sell your market. So this is the best platform for balancing the renewable energy. So the point that I'm saying is that while you need a balanced portfolio, but if you can bring in some reforms in terms of the overall market design, you can address this balancing need and requirement. And to answer to the question that has been put in the Q&A, I mean, at least my personal view is that, I mean, COVID possibly may not necessarily lead to a big shift in terms of the clean energy addition. Sorry, I mean, this was not a question that Pradyumna you asked, but then since it was a sequel coming from the previous discussion, I thought I must share India's experience. This real-time market is something which you must go back and have a look, and if you need, I can share some more insight after this discussion. Now,
indeed, it's a freewheeling discussion, so it's always good to have spontaneity.
So I thought, let me, I mean, move out of the, charted line being given by Pradyumna, because that's the liberty you can take as a panelist. So I could not resist my temptation. Now, again, briefly, I mean, honoring the time constraint, I would like to talk about recovery briefly. Three-pronged strategies, I mean, and that in fact addresses some of the fundamental issues raised by Rula right at the beginning as to whether immediate response that we do in terms of a bailout, whether is it a long-term kind of a solution. Answer is no. In Indian context also, I mean, the strategy has been three-pronged, more in terms of immediate response first, which is, crisis handling. So what do you know? What do you need? I mean, immediately you need some crisis handling in the form of some bailouts. Thereafter, there has been some, strategy in terms of medium-term strategies in terms of recovery, and then long-term in terms of the resilience of the whole sector. I mean, we have come up with several SOPs, which is more like an emergency kind of a bailout, COVID was declared as a force majeure, which led to various orders by the regulators in terms of, deferment of some capacity charges. It also, I mean, we also, reduced the payment security mechanism, or also the late payment surcharge that we charge. So some of the steps that we have taken are already, articulated and there in the website of the regulator, or for that matter, the policymakers, the government of India. But then the point is that it's been a three-pronged strategy. Some bailouts, large number of bailouts, of course. I mean, time would not permit me to go through all the bailouts, but then, in the second, and briefly to talk about the second one, which is the recovery, which is the medium term. Now, once you, even after you have given the bailout, some sort of like deferment of the payment by the distribution companies to the generators, that's not a long-term solution, because they don't have money coming from the consumers, which they can leverage to pay to the transmission companies and distribution companies. So what the government of India did, it came up with a package, where the arms, Power Finance Corporation of India is a financial arm of the government of India. So, $12 billion equivalent package stimulus was provided to help distribution companies. It's more in the form of a loan. So this you can use to pay to the transmission and distribution companies. This is being further enhanced to 16 billion. But then again, the realization is that this is also a medium-term kind of a solution. It's not a long-term solution. Long-term solution lies in structural reforms, which are badly required in the power sector and in India. And I think policymakers and regulators are trying to the extent possible to use this as an opportunity, this crisis as an opportunity to push for the structural reforms. That's in brief. I mean, time permitting, I can elaborate further on each of these things. Let me honor time. Yeah. Over to you, Pradeep.
Thank you for the time. And Alex, coming to this point of bailouts and structural reforms, we don't hear so much from Brazil about bailouts, but is there any plans in Brazil to support the power sector with some bailouts, or is the government also taking this outlook of having long-term structural reforms and using COVID as a stepping stone towards these?
I think both measures are in place. We have to have a basket of measures to deal with all the consequences. We did have in Brazil in the past 20 years other 3 black swans in the electricity sector, if I can say so. In 2001, we had a large drought that made us cut 20% of the electricity supply. So this was a problem in the supply side. And then in 2008, we had a world financial crisis. And then in 2015, a domestic economic and political crisis. The 2 last ones in lower level than COVID, the first one in a higher level than COVID, and all of them impacting the cash flow of the distribution companies. So that provided some experience regarding the measures that were taken in the short term and also that are planned for the long term. Regarding COVID, in the beginning, there were some major concerns from which I will highlight 3 of them. The first one was the capacity of payment, especially by low-income population. So what happened is that supply cuts due to lack of payment were not allowed for at least 3 months for residential consumers, and low-income consumers, those below 220 kilowatt hours of consumption per month, were exempted of payment for 3 months. So there was money that was used from a specific account that was used to pay for those bills, to allow them to continue to have electricity and to avoid many problems regarding lack of payment of bills from people that were more severely affected from COVID. There was also a temporary suspension on increase of tariffs to avoid elevation of costs during this specific period of COVID. And then there was the impact on the distribution company's cash flow. Since the system is based on long-term PPAs in which the distribution companies contract energy for 20, 30 years ahead, and this is just a dip in these long-term contracts that required liquidity for the distribution companies to pay to honor those payments. And then a financing line a little bit lower than the Indian one was established, around $5 billion. And that financial line, each company will receive the amount of money they need, that they will contract, and it will end up in the tariffs up to the end of 2025. So we will see effects of COVID up to 2025 for sure in the tariffs. And since 1 billion reais is roughly equivalent in a rule of thumb to 1% increase in the tariffs, this means that this loan might signify, sorry about my English, some words just go away, up to 25% increase in the tariffs in the long term. So you're going to see an increase in the cost of electricity because of that. But there is a search for funds in sector accounts, even in unused research and development accounts. So we are trying to scrape the barrel to avoid tariff increases. Anywhere there is money available, this money is being used to supply the funds to avoid tariff increase in this moment and in the near future. And then the third one is the overall security of the system. So meter reading was not obligatory by the companies, and billing by the average was allowed for some times where possible. Digital services, digital meetings with the company and consumers were incentivized. Remote work was widely used, including in the system operator for the transmission. And ANEL, the regulator, even reported an economy of $3 million by the use of remote work. So they didn't use that much money. But there is another problem. So the pandemic hit in a moment in which we were discussing efforts for the modernization of the sector. We were talking about further opening of the free market, which is today for consumers more than 2 megawatts in demand. The use of hourly prices for operation and trading, the influence of intermittent sources such as wind and solar, reduction of subsidies, efforts will continue, but they will be slowed. The pace will be reduced in these following months. And also, there is the implementation of a new gas model in which there was discussion about the use of inflexible gas power plants in the system. With the reduction of demand, maybe this will have to wait a little bit, or this might open space for other technologies, such as solar with storage. I don't know, maybe it will come fast and will replace gas in the near future. We don't know what's going to happen. But as I said, water reservoirs are in better shape, generation was cleaner, less emissions, and digitalization was improved. So I think we went in the good direction in the end with this problem and try to make a lemonade out of this lemon.
I think, yeah, there is some silver lining. I think innovation got a big push, and digitalization, like you said, the meter readings, I think that was a problem everywhere in the world where you could not read meters, and now that probably would push towards more digitalization in the meter reading.
If you don't mind me having 30 seconds on that, there are some side effects on that. So meters were not read, and then there was a average billing by the average.
Exactly.
But people were at home and consuming more. So when the next bill came with the reading, the bill was way bigger than expected. So this is a side effect that had some companies had a problem with that.
Yeah, indeed. Rula, moving to you, and now I think we already have started having a more freewheeling discussion, like I said before, and we can take the question from Jacqueline as well, because it was addressed to you, one, and Sushanta answered it a bit in the Indian context where they did see more renewables being used rather than thermal. But the question is, in the case of South Africa, how is it? How do you see this question of maybe the shift away from renewables, because priorities might have changed? Maybe there is more focus on healthcare, or shifting of these funding, like what Alex was saying, everybody is now scraping the barrel. Governments are also not in the best financial shape because of tax collection and other issues. So how do you see this long-term shift? Maybe you can add that to your question.
So I think it's not surprising. I should have been expecting that, and listening to the colleagues today, I find so many similarities between these countries, even though we have such different backgrounds, supply mixes, policies, histories. I find so many similarities. So actually, when Susanta was answering to that question, I found myself looking at my notes and saying, has he read my notes now? How does he know all of these things that I wanted to say? So in a footnote, well done. I don't know how you picked all of us, but it's like we are in sync. I'm getting keywords and buzzwords from both colleagues, from both Alex and Susanta, that it's points that I wanted to touch and they touched it. So I'm very happy. So just to touch first on a little bit on the cost effectiveness of renewables, which we all know it is completely different compared to how it was 10 years ago. To give you an example, in recent, I'm going to give you data from 2018. We had the energy auctions, and the tariffs for wind and solar, the levelized cost of energy for wind and solar was 40% cheaper than the levelized cost of 2 coal-dependent power plants that we have. So if that's an indication of the path to the future, we are looking at different conditions. We can't continue with this mindset that we had when we were setting the supply mix until now. Having said that, the coal abundance in South Africa makes coal an easier solution, okay, and the historical coal generation. However, I see in the broader African continent, and to link with what Jacqueline was asking there, I see a general, as you said, innovation and technological progress catching up and almost leapfrogging in many of the African countries, from no access to energy to using island grids, smart grids, small grids, not passing through the national grid path in a way. So I think we will not, the speed of adoption of renewables might be impacted by the COVID, as you said, because of the priorities and the funding and the budgets, the government budgets, etc. But I don't think that we're going to see a shift away from renewables, especially in the view of the commitments, particularly South Africa has made with regard to climate change. So now is the time to start bringing that in our discussions. The supply mix of a country nowadays is not only dependent on the cost minimization method, but also emission reduction potential. So my view is, in South Africa, there is a certain political willingness, a will to go forward to renewables. The implementation is something that we need to still see. But if you look at our strategies and the discussions and the way we are thinking of things, climate change mitigation is high in the agenda. I heard one of the colleagues talking about prepaid meters and in general meters and how innovation and technology can move us forward. In South Africa, I was actually reading a couple of papers last week. We have the population not accepting, especially rural areas, not accepting favorably the prepaid meters. So we have quite a lot of work to do with regards to awareness. And I argued in many forums during lockdown, both for higher education and for energy, that now it's the time to rethink of all of these things. And if we don't take this opportunity now with this, then the opportunity might be lost forever until Alex spoke about many black swans, but if you see many black swans, then they're not black swans anymore. They're just but if we don't take this opportunity now, when will we take this opportunity? That's the idea that I have in my mind. And how do we take this opportunity? I like the idea that Alex referred to on research and development. Now is the time for that. Now is the time to see clearly the problems and look forward. And we're talking about renewable energies. We see the cost effectiveness, we see the flexibility, but we should also look at CCS, so carbon storage, and the storage, the battery technologies. How will these technologies bring us a good societal return? And not only with a view of saving the utility and saving the finances of a utility, but more broadly. Finally, just the last point I would like to make in the interest of time, Susanna spoke about market structures fundamentals. And I think I was saying to myself, it's not the place, but now Susanna gave me the step. The South African Association for Energy Economics, the topic of this year's conference is exactly that. It's the market reform, it's democratization of the markets, it's liberalization of the markets, and where are we going forward? Because in South Africa, we're talking about a monopolistic, regulated environment that is very politically influenced. The political influence directs the path of the sector. How do we move from that towards more flexible systems, more competitive? We're not going to move to perfect competition from the one day to another, but to more competitive systems, more inclusive systems, both from a fuels, but also agents, stakeholders point of view. How do we get the private sector to mobilize the private sector? Because clearly, from the discussions we hear, there are market failures that the governments are trying to fix, but the way the economies are structured this way, we need to look further than that. And then I like the idea of back to basics. It's when we look at the market structures, what are we missing? There's nothing then going back to basics. So in South Africa, we had this, there is still this discussion of unbundling the electricity regulator. So taking Eskom and breaking it down into three separate units, the generation, transmission, and distribution units, and then maybe open the market in some of these units. Unfortunately now with the COVID, this whole decision was delayed. Not the decision, but now the implementation of such decision. When are we going to see something like that? How is it going to work? How will it affect employment in the sector? Because that's the other very important thing in all emerging economies, the high unemployment rates we are facing. So it's interesting to see that there is a movement because we understand something is not working. And I hear the silver lining. So we need to make sure that the stakeholders work together to make a difference, to use the available tools and instruments we have to make a difference in the future.
Indeed, I mean, I can see that more than COVID, this also brings us to many other interesting topics. Sushanta already touched upon real-time markets, and what Alex and Rula you spoke about was that there's a delay in implementation because some things got delayed and you don't know when. While on the other hand, CRC pushed through and said, okay, we will delay it by I think 2 months, but they did implement the real-time markets, and kudos to them for doing that. Also, another very interesting point is prepaid meters, very widely discussed in India's perspective as well of applying prepaid meters. But now it's another interesting learning here that it's got resisted in Africa, in South Africa in your case. I think Brazil has a much more, I think, connected system. I don't know if you have prepaid systems, but the problems and issues in Brazil are unique to the country, especially this drought, which comes every 7 years. And now you will have a very different world to go to with more water in the reservoirs when you visit Brazil again. But as we have 3 minutes and a little more, I would like to give each of you 1 minute for sort of your closing comments and about, we talked so much about opportunity that we should look into the future and it's not the end of the world, as we say it. So a very quick idea of your closing thoughts and about where you see opportunity and just what do you see, where do you see the power sector headed in the coming years? Alex, sorry, let's start from you this time.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much. Well, there are many opportunities for countries to collaborate and opportunities ahead in each electricity sector. I see for Brazil a possibility of a boost in regional markets and interconnections that we have with Argentina, Paraguay, Uruguay, Bolivia and Venezuela especially, and globally for exchange of best practices such as what we are doing here. In Brazil, we will probably see an increase in electrification due to all of this problem, and transport might be something that will increase more than expected. Growth in distributed generation, depending on the exchange rate. We have solar rooftop maybe going to up to 10% of the installed capacity during this decade, and that will require special and further regulation. Digitalization will surely grow. We included even public participation, purely digital public participation as a regulatory tool. There is remote working, remote operation, remote oversight by the regulator as well. And also, I see big opportunities for international investment since Brazil got 30% cheaper right now. So it will be very easy to see some international players coming to Brazil and seeking opportunities for investment.
Indeed, we already see some from India participating in the hydro auctions in Brazil in the previous years and really cutting down the hydro prices quite significantly. Sushanta, from a South Asian perspective, do you see more interlinkages now with Southeast Asia also? And how do you see international participation?
Well, I mean, first to briefly talk about the Indian sector in terms of opportunity. I said that COVID, in fact, is a crisis, but it also gives you an opportunity to act. I mean, this is the time when you can really act on some of the big bang changes. Of course, I mean, you can prepare the blueprint, and there would be cases for acceptance as you go along. If you can, inject the whole reforms vaccine in a graded manner, in a calibrated manner. So as I said, I mean, real-time market is one such step that we have taken. We consider it as a big step that would go a long way in terms of, and in fact, that just to briefly touch upon the question that Jacqueline has once again asked, especially addressed to me, on the real-time market, I feel it would help solar more than hydro, because variability of solar you can manage by leveraging on the real-time market. And there are other, like digitization that is being talked about. Business process re-engineering is another big opportunity that I see happening. We have already started, relying heavily on the technology for all such interactions and all that. We see a big change in terms of the processes that manual processes that take a lot of time, getting converted into a digital one, which will ease the business processes going forward. In terms of the cooperation with the South Asian nations, which pointedly you asked, of course, I mean, we have been exploring as to what extent and how we can harness the relative potential available with the neighboring countries. We have cross-border kind of a regulatory framework. At political level, dialogues are on, but even amongst the regulators, we have another forum called South Asia Forum for Infrastructure Regulation, SAFIR, which we in fact serve as secretariat, CERC, through this. And we have also been trying to, leverage on this particular platform to see and harness as much as possible for mutual benefit of the resources. It's pretty good in terms of the South Asian mix. If you have a look at it, you have hydro in Bhutan, Nepal, so how best we can exploit the complementarities that exist between the nations is what, at least at the regulator level, within the regulatory domain that we have. I can't comment on the political kind of a thing, but then within the regulatory domain, whatever is possible, we are trying to do on the South Asian region.
Thank you, Sushanta. And finally, Rula, I think you already mentioned a lot of things on looking at the future outlook. So after listening to Alex and Sushanta, maybe I'll let you have a last word.
Thank you, Brad. So from my point of view, I hear that there is a certain need for regional collaboration, looking at natural resources, looking at policies, looking at generation approaches, supply mixes, etc. So we need to start looking beyond borders, especially discussing climate change. Climate change is not something that I know we attribute it to a certain couple of countries, but we're talking about a global incident. And I think COVID was a good reminder for that, that under this pandemic, all countries had the same vulnerability. Some reacted differently, but essentially we were the same, all against the same, let's call it, common enemy. I particularly want to draw attention a little bit on technological spillovers and not double doing the efforts, start collaborating in a global environment that we can look what's happening now with the vaccines. That's a very good idea of how global collaboration can work and does work. Although even the competition between the institutes for the vaccine creates some efficiency in that domain. And then finally, another thing that I usually discuss with my master students quite a lot is there is a certain feeling that emerging economies like Brazil, like India and South Africa, we have to learn from the industrial economies. We have to follow their example. But the historical evidence shows that they didn't do everything correctly and nothing works 100%. So if we follow the same path, we might lead to the same problem. So maybe it's about time that we get out of this mindset of following the path, but learning from previous mistakes and looking at how synergies can work and looking at how which technologies have worked and which ones we can bypass and go to the next technology generation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rula. That was a very interesting ending statement that yeah, indeed, like life, the lives of countries are also unique and each one has its own specificities. And we have to learn from each other, learn from people who have made mistakes and look for technology and regulatory leapfrogging where possible. In general, yes, we are in unprecedented black swan event time, but as we can see from our experts, I can conclude by saying that there is a silver lining. There is a lot of opportunity in the future, and we are looking at a lot of positive measures being taken by regulators, policymakers, and the industry across the world. With that, I would like to thank all our three panelists, and I will hand over to David for any last words. Thank you so much. And I would also like to thank all our attendees. Thank you so much for the questions as well.
Thank you, Brad, and thank you all of our distinguished panelists for truly an outstanding webinar. Certainly did learn a lot myself. Yes, we're all in this together. Yes, we're all going to work our way out of this together, and we much appreciate your help and support. For those listening, please remember that this webinar has been recorded, will be available on our Rewind, will be on our website this afternoon. Please share it with your friends and colleagues. A reminder, if you're not a member of the association, we welcome you to join by visiting our website at www.iaee.org. Thank you once again for listening. Wish you a good afternoon, a good evening, a good morning, wherever this finds you on our fine globe. Thank you very much. Bye now.